Vi befinner oss på Engelsbergs bruk i Bergslagen där 2023 års Engelsbergsseminarium äger rum. Temat i år är Leadership and Statecraft. I det pass vi nu ska få ta del av ligger fokus på de stora maktblocken USA, Ryssland, Kina och relationerna dem emellan.
So in this session we have the focus on current geopolitics with Wieslander as our first speaker. The United States and NATO will come up on the stage.
Thank you very much. Yes, so this is a session on Powerblocs, and we thought we would start then with the United States as the still leading power in the world, but increasingly put under pressure from rivals such as China and Russia. Its alliances are a main asset on the global arena, and NATO is the most important alliance of them all. So during 2022, the US presented both a national security strategy and a national defense strategy, while NATO adopted a new strategic concept. So I will take a look at both of those documents and try to answer a few questions. How do these strategic documents compare in terms of assessing rivals and adversaries? What do they tell us about how the US and NATO are adapting to a more dangerous and competitive world? And also, in the end, is the transatlantic community holding together or drifting apart? Do these documents tell us or give us any kind of guidance in regard to this? But I will start in trying to frame these documents into the international system and how it's changing from what we have heard from previous panels, also discussing the Cold War. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was this transition from bipolarity to a system dominated by the United States, a unipolar system with the United States as the only remaining superpower, and basically dominating the international system for quite some time ahead. We had Russian President Vladimir Putin. He complained about American dominance in the world in his famous Munich security speech in 2007. But he also admitted in that speech that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, even the Russians preferred the American way, that is, democracy, freedom, and openness. This lasted for quite some time, even though it was disputed. You remember it was called the unipolar moment or the unipolar illusion. But for the past, since up until 2014, most scholars seems to agree, and I adhere to that as well, that the world was unipolar when we had the first Russian invasion, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and the Russian start of the war in Donbass. However, China and Russia had started at that time to act as rivals in global affairs, but it was not really acknowledged by the United States at that time. By 2022, almost a decade later, at the releases of its strategic documents, it's quite clear that great power competition has been acknowledged as a main characteristic of the international system, affecting the way that America has to relate to its allies, and including then, of course, not least NATO. So for the Biden administration, a core feature of its foreign policy is to work closer with allies. As the United States acknowledges its decreasing power relative to other rising global actors, Washington understands it cannot really dominate the conditions of world politics anymore alone. In the decade that will set the terms of geopolitical competition between major powers, as it is described, the US seeks to invest in its allies while setting high expectations on them in competing against adversaries in the contest for the future of the world. And that future is a future between democracies or autocracies. So that is how the picture is made. And the US then, interestingly enough, I think, envisions and recognizes that the unipolar era is over. They want a bipolar world. And this is still a world where the US can lead, and where the US is not one of several poles in a multipolar system. That is not what the US wants, and the coming decade will really set the terms on whether that is achievable or not for the US. And the possible nightmare is, of course, a new unipolar world by 2050 dominated by China. But that is not really explicit, but it's underlying in some of the analysis as well. And what is important then for allies to kind of fetch is this expectations from the US side to still accept US leadership and to kind of align in this mixture of Francis Fukuyama kind of proposition that democracy is still the best solution, and if once people have been experiencing it, this is what they will choose. And a more realist stance, Mersheimer, Waltz, and others that kind of say that rival that's inevitable, and this is what you have to take. You have to pick the fight and take it. What we heard also Mrs. Thatcher, the way she envisioned the world. So this is what we have now, and what does that mean when the US kind of meets NATO? Well, from the American point of view, NATO is the concrete expression of its obligation to kind of have an indivisible security community between America and Europe. And NATO is the central instrument in that to pursue a US-led international order based on these universal values and free trade, aiming to promote peace and security. And on a more practical level, NATO is an instrument to deal efficiently with European affairs. And that's always shadowed by the question from the American side that, Henry Kissinger posted in the 1970s, but it's still that question, who do you call when you want to call Europe? So NATO is important from the American side in that perspective still. But there is a major shift for NATO or European allies to also take note in here when we scrutinize the strategic documents of the United States, and that is that the American agenda with European allies, it's transatlantic in its foundation, but it's global in its ambition. So this is not a piece of the pie that just affects Europe. What the American wants to build is something much bigger together with the Europeans at this stage. And that's quite a big shift if you compare to 2014, 2018 strategic documents, when Europe was more called upon assisting the United States as the leader of the world. Now the US wants to build with the Europeans alongside them. So they are inviting Europeans along, not only in defense, but in trade, technology, investments, and so on. And this is what the European allies also have to respond to. Now, if we look at the threats and see what assessment the United States does, and when you look at NATO, how much are there divergences or are they identical? We can see that both the US and NATO sees China, Russia, and terrorism as the core security threats, but they prioritize them differently, and that's not completely surprising, since the US is a global actor and NATO is by its formation a regional security organization. But still, it is interesting to note that the US clearly states that the US is prioritizing the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific and then the Russia challenge in Europe. So that's a clear hierarchy in that sense, while NATO, on the other side, is very clear in its concept that Russia is the most significant and direct threat to Allied security. So here we have a differentiation in how you see this. It shouldn't be exaggerated in the short term, but because there is alignment on that Russia is an immediate threat, and there is alignment on how this affects the need to deal with Ukraine war, because Russia is also threatening the international order. But it's not threatening the international order in the same way as China does, because China, from the American perspective, is the only power with the aggregated capacity, militarily, socially, economically, technically, to actually completely shift the international system to China's advantage and US disadvantage. Russia, on the other hand, is seen as a waning power, and that's a huge difference when it comes to the mindset of the Americans. China can reshape the international system. Russia can disturb it, but not really reshape it, looking ahead into the future. China, I think our next speaker, Benedetta, you will touch upon this much more in detail, but China came rather recently on the NATO agenda, and you can see that both US and China and NATO are now seeing China as this multi-domain challenge, it's a win, you can say, for the US that in the strategic concept China is kind of described this way, but I will come back to in the end that there are still discrepancies on this, but you can take note that China is included in the strategic concept for the first time, and that is something that the US has been pushing for. I want to mention also the question of nuclear deterrence, because that's really important also when it comes to understanding how the US views China. So this is also an area where we have a big shift from the US perspective, and the fact that China is quickly building up its nuclear arsenal, 250 missile silos, could have up to 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. That means for the United States that for the first time since nuclear weapons emerged on the global scene, they will have to have strategic deterrence in two directions. And that's a huge challenge. That will have to shift the whole nuclear posture of the United States, probably will lead to an increase in nuclear warheads, and it will affect NATO and European allies as well when it comes to extended deterrence, and possibly also expectations on what we can provide when it comes to nuclear sharing. And then I just want to briefly touch upon terrorism as well, because it's also very interesting to note, I think, that the way that the US is now looking at terrorism, its war on terror, this whole era symbolized by the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that is over for the United States. So terrorism, counterterrorism is put lower when it comes to priority. We can see it on how the US is withdrawing from the Middle East, opening up for all kinds of new dynamics in the Middle East. And also its increasing focus on domestic terrorism. It's the first time that term appears in a national security strategy document in modern times. Has, of course, to do with what happened in Capitolium on January 6th, and the consequences that has for how the US thinks about terrorism. That is not reflected in NATO or the strategic document, and quite on the contrary, for some NATO allies in Europe, terrorism is still a very high on the agenda. Sweden has to deal with that when it comes to its dialogue with Turkey now on becoming a member. That is at the core of the Turkish mindset. And you have other allies as well, France and others, that's still important for them to an extent that it's not. It will not be the US perhaps driving that, but European allies driving that within NATO agenda. And then, if we just round up here on how this will play out within the transatlantic community. I think you should note that President Macron, after his China visit, One of his conclusions was that Europe faced the threat of becoming a vassal, he called it, between the United States and China, while it could be a third pole. We had Chancellor Scholz in May speaking in European Parliament saying that the world is multipolar and has been for a long time. And the German Zeitenwende clearly refers to Russia, but not to China. So we have here China, and the American way of looking at China as, you know, a rival and adversary is not reflected on the European scene at all. There is public support on viewing Russia that way in Europe, 62% according to the latest DSFR poll, but not China. It's still mostly a partner, possibly a rival, a competitor, but there is no agreement here. So I would conclude in sum, I think this is the main message here, that China is the long-term strategic challenge, yes. In the US, bipartisan support for this assessment, and it's potentially the biggest divide across the Atlantic, and possible alignment between the US and Europe on China will have a big influence on shaping also the international system ahead. So thank you very much.
Anna, will the Finnish membership in NATO and the possible Swedish change NATO's strategy?
I think it will solidify NATO's strategy because it will, I think the most important contribution there will be that NATO becomes stronger, and it will indirectly also make the EU stronger because we are members of the EU. So in a way, it will help solidify the West in this future competition.
And it's of importance to the United States as well.
It is definitely, because you get one solution, and that's what the US is striving for when it comes to Europe.
Thank you, and let's get the NATO Brussels perspective with Benedetta Berti. Thank you. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'll go straight to the presentation because I know the clock is ticking and you'll let me know when I'm out of time.
No, not yet.
Great. So while you...
Now.
It's gone. Okay. So I'm going... So good afternoon. It's great to be here. I am a NATO official, but I'm going to try to be as spontaneous and speak as much as possible in a personal capacity to make this a little bit more dynamic. Right. So I would start by saying that in terms of having a seminar dedicated to the topic of leadership at statecrafts, I think there is a very strong rationale to have at least a couple of presentations of NATO in it, because I think it's a prime example of how visionary leadership on the one hand and pragmatic statecrafts on the other came together with a powerful idea, 1949, which was, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty, and just as importantly, shortly after, the idea of putting an O as organization in the North Atlantic Treaty and create an institution that would be vested with the responsibility of upholding and preserving that treaty. So after a day of really important presentation from historians, you will bear with me as a political scientist, and I will tell you a little bit about the power of institutions in addition to individual leaders. And I think NATO at its core back then, and just as importantly now, can, if used right, be an instrumental tool of grand strategy to deal with what is ultimately an all-encompassing multi-domain competition and struggle over who decides what the international order looks like and what principles govern us all. And that was certainly the logic behind the establishment of NATO during the Cold War, and I think now that we're back in a time of strategic competition, that logic is just as important. So why NATO mattered back then and why it matters now? I think, first of all, solid foundations, and I would point out two ideas that were important in 49 and are just as relevant in 2023. The first one is that in order to lead the free world, which was the title of the previous panel, you do need to have a strong convergence between Europe and North America. And you can never take that strong convergence for granted, but to the contrary, you have to build it, cement it, and continuously reinforce it. And that's really was why NATO from day one was a political/strategic project, and it continues to be so today. The common, very simple idea is our common freedom, security, and prosperity is underpinned by us being able to have concerted action together as the anchor of the political West. True then, true now, because we are back in a time of geopolitical competition. We're back in a time of contestation, where we see assertive authoritarian powers trying to rewrite the rules of the game, and in which is even more important to have that unity to contain a revisionist design, to preserve our open, free, and rules and rights-based world order, and to advance the space of freedom. So I'm just trying to make the case that it was a political notion at the bottom of it all, and it remains so today. Of course, it's coupled by another really important organizing principle, and that is you cannot defend Europe if you don't have a collective framework that makes us all work together. And in the process, and that's really the logic behind NATO as the framework for the organization of the collective defense of Europe, which is the only one we have and that functions and is reliable. And in the process of organizing our collective defense, you also transform our strategic cultures and enable us to work together to an extent which would have been completely unthinkable only 7 short decades ago. So the foundations remain solid, and I think they're just as relevant today as they were in 49. The other element that was, I think, very smart in 49 is that there was a strong strategic clarity about what we want to achieve, but it was enormous flexibility about the how. And that's why I think the alliance has really gone through various different lives. We had a NATO during the Cold War, was extremely focused, a military organization, defense agenda, one theater, one threat, one purpose, prevent an all-out war with the Soviet Union. Then the Cold War ended, and we had 3-4 decades of a post-Cold War NATO, in which really the political element took the center stage through the process of enlargement as a key enabler of what is essentially a political project of Europe whole and free, through the agenda of partnerships, through the shifting from defense to security. So that political age of NATO, right? I'm doing 74 years of history in 15 minutes, so bear with me. My main point is, fast forward to now, 2022, we are in a third age, at least, of the alliance. And if you want to see, a testament to that, I would recommend to read the latest strategy that the alliance adopted in June 2022. And I promise I'm not just saying that because I'm the person who wrote it. I genuinely think it reflects a shift in mindset. And it's a back to the future NATO. On the one element, it's back to the core. So from security out of area or out of business, we're back to the territorial defense of Europe is our bread and butter. Our defense, territorial, conventional defense cannot be taken for granted, and we have to rebuild our posture and essentially relearn what we forgot for over 4 decades when it comes to deterrence and defense. So it's really back to the core. And that is underpinned by, I think, a profound assumption, a profound shattering of the post-Cold War assumptions, right? We had these 3-4 decades of peace dividend era, especially in Western Europe. We were essentially thought that the Euro-Atlantic area is a space of stability, predictability, shared norms, one in which de facto we can de-emphasize defense and do other things. I think that assumption is gone. And we're going to go, if you look at your immediate to mid-term future, is a future in which we need to spend more in defense, we need to rebuild our armies, we need to take our military instruments of power seriously if we want to compete in a world of strategic competition, and at least in our primary neighborhood, which is the Euro-Atlantic area, we need to prepare for a long-term adversarial relationship with Russia, and in which, of course, what happens to us all depends on what happens in Ukraine, and that's why Ukrainian victory is first step towards the reestablishment of anything that resembles a European security order. Close parenthesis. So first element of Back to the Future NATO is we're going back to a serious refocusing on our deterrence and defense posture. But with my remaining 5 to 6 minutes or whatever I have, I wouldn't want you to get the impression that it's back to a Cold War mindset, NATO. It is not, because the word is no longer a word of a bipolar confrontation, and so many of the underlying assumptions of the Cold War just don't apply today. So yes, back to the core in terms of deterrence and defense, but very much cognizant of the fact that the main trend that defines our strategic environment, as Anna said many times, it's strategic competition. And that means, well, first of all, we can no longer think about one threat, one theater, one domain. It just doesn't work that way. Yes, the primary military theater for NATO will remain the Euro-Atlantic, but if you read the strategic concept carefully, it is clear that there is a recognition that Russia and China together are leading an authoritarian pushback against the rules-based international order. The China challenge is systemic, and it is systemic to our democracy, societies, and security. And that the interlinkages between Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theater are only bound to become more important, more consequential for our security and stability into the future. So that's one of the reasons why, even in the midst of everything that is happening in Europe, one of our priorities is to strengthen our relationship with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. So it's no longer just thinking through one theater, it's really through a global security, global understanding of security. And the other element is that, of course, our strategic competitors, and partly because our deterrence and defense posture is very good on the conventional and nuclear side, that means our competitors are challenging us more and more below the spectrum. So the non-kinetic elements are becoming more and more important. What I'm talking about, economic vulnerabilities, economic coercion, attacks to our soft underbelly, whether it's our democratic institutions, strategic corruption, our critical infrastructure, assets, standards. That's where we are contested and challenged on a day-to-day basis. And I think that my contention is looking into the future, these non-kinetic challenges to our economic security and resilience are going to be more and more important to our security and to our ability to fulfill our mission. And that's why, yes, we're rebuilding conventional and nuclear deterrence and defense, but we're also putting a premium on the importance of fostering transatlantic resilience when it comes to our ability to defend, project power, and compete. And that's why the discussions on economic security and economic deterrence are becoming much more important also in a NATO context. One might say, well, what does this mean? Is the organization going to try to catch it all and lose its purpose? And I would say, no, it's going back to understanding that the linkages between the military and the non-military are incredibly strong, and underpinning our ability to do deterrence and defense credibly rest our ability to foster transatlantic convergence on key strategic issues, be it our policies over critical infrastructures, our energy policies. How do we work on our energy transition without importing new dependencies on the PRC, for example? And that's really the work that we're doing right now at NATO. So it's really, in a way, back to basics on the deterrence and defense side, but in a context of strategic competition. And that means putting back the importance of NATO as the only transatlantic platform where you can foster convergence on what is ultimately, I think, the defining question for the future of the transatlantic community, and that is how do we deal together with the challenge posed by China to our values, to our governments, and to the rules and right-based international order. I think I can keep on talking, but how am I doing with that?
I could keep on listening, but thank you very much.
I think I'm out of time, right?
Oh, yes, brilliantly.
Yeah, okay. Done. In that case, I'm done.
You can, please.
Oh, I stay. Yeah.
Please stay. Well, if sort of the European members of NATO think Russia is a great threat, and the United States, as we have learned, say China is the priority now, what has happened in the discussions between the Europeans and the United States?
Well, I think we all agree that sitting here today, we're in the midst of there is a fully fledged war the likes we haven't seen in decades in Europe. And NATO, the 30 allies, 31 now, soon to be 32 allies of NATO, agreed that the most direct and strategic threat to the territorial defense of Europe to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of our allies and to Euro-Atlantic peace and stability is Russia. There's no question about that. But you cannot look at that in isolation. Russia is one element of a broader context of rising strategic competition. The Russia-China convergence over what I would call a revisionist, revanchist design over the future of the rules-based international order is the biggest game. So we have to be able to use an American way of speaking, to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, we are refocusing on the territorial defense of Europe, but ignore China at your own peril, because that is the pacing challenge. So we are trying to focus as an alliance on the primary threat. And from a military perspective, that's clearly where NATO's primary role is. But from a political and strategic perspective, it's clear that we also have to have those consultations so that we can have concerted action over, well, creating those common standard principles, rules, and actions that we need to deal with the challenge that China poses. So,
you said that the North Atlantic is now stretching to the Pacific Ocean. Has any sort of strategy been formulated about this?
Right, yeah. First of all, caveat, I do not mean that our operational engagement and military deployments is on two theaters. That's not what NATO is for. The military footprint is on the Euro-Atlantic theater. But the notion is there are so many threats and challenges that connect the two theaters. And just like, for example, it is clear to our Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, that what is happening, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as a fundamental and detrimental impact on the rules-based international order. By the same token, we understand that any security crisis in the Indo-Pacific, on the South China Sea, or in and around Taiwan would have a disruptive and paralyzing impact for us as Europeans and for the transatlantic community. And then there's so many threats and challenges we share, from cyber to hybrid. So much of what threatens our security is actually not bound by geography. So the strategies we work together.
Thank you, Benedetta, this far.
Thank you.
Gudrun Persson, not predicting the outcome of the war, but letting us understand more of why it started and where it's drifting. I think so. I hope you're not going to predict any outcome, because no one can.
You have to listen for 15 minutes to get an answer to that. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'll start with a reflection from this morning's discussion on leadership and statecraft. And I was thinking about a Russian military theorist called Andrei Kokoschin, who has written extensively on strategic planning and strategic decision-making in Russia. And he always emphasizes and underlines the importance in strategic decision-making is to make a sound and sober evaluation of one's own strengths and weaknesses. And he says it's no less difficult than to do it for the enemy. This evaluation should be a restraint when setting the political goals for the coming operation. I want you to bear that in mind as a background. So now, currently, we're 9 years into the war, 1.5 since the large-scale Russian invasion. This begs for the question of when war starts, rather than the more common one these days, when does the war end? But I will leave that aside for the moment and instead try to put the war into context, explore the roots of Russia's strategic behavior and its consequences for Russia and its neighbors. First, it's worth remembering that this is by far not the first time that Russia is waging a war in Ukraine. I'd like to remind you of Herman Gumerus, then head of the Finnish legation in Kiev in 1918 to 1919. He wrote about when Bolshevik fighters, including regular Russian armed forces, made incursions in the northeast of Ukraine, in the Kharkiv area. And finally, on the 9th of January 1919, the Ukrainian government got so fed up with this, so they sent a note to Moscow asking that the war operations were halted and that Russian troops were withdrawn immediately. Moscow replied, "There are no Russian troops in Ukraine, and we don't have any responsibility whatsoever for what irregular formations are doing." The efforts then to gain independence failed, but Gumeros reminds us the world can no longer doubt the existence of a Ukrainian nation. And he wrote, "The Ukrainian leaders are adamant. Their goal is a complete divorce from Russia." Now, about the current war. Initially, clearly, the decision was primarily taken by President Putin and the security services. Now, this blitzkrieg plan failed, and now it's the armed forces war again. There are parallels here to Afghanistan, 1979, to my mind. And Putin has made clear that he sees the Chechen wars of the 1990s as the model to follow. The lessons learned from the Chechen wars and the events in Kosovo in 1999 by the Russian political and military leadership were the following, as a Russian academic wrote at the time. The main lesson is that the goal justifies the means. The use of force is the most efficient problem solver if applied decisively and massively. Negotiations are of dubious value and are to be used as a cover for military action. Legality of state actions, observation of laws and legal procedures, and humanitarian suffering are of secondary significance relative to achieving the goal. Limiting one's own troop casualties is worth imposing massive devastation and collateral fatalities on civilian populations. Foreign public opinion and the position of Western governments are to be discounted if Russian interests are at stake. So, what, then, is the background to the current situation? I'd like you to remember that war and conflict in Russia is seen as strategy at the highest level. It is politics with other means. They hold on to their Clausewitz here. And the strategic political goals set for all this remain intact, regardless of the temporary setbacks on the battlefield. As for the goals, they have been trumpeted out from the Kremlin for over 15 years. Russia is on a strategic offensive. Ultimately, this is about restoring the empire in some form or another. Second, the drivers for Russia's war against Ukraine emanate from Russia. All security policy begins at home. We've seen the dynamic working between inner repression and outer aggression in a strong dynamic for the past 10 years. And already, to be honest, already in the 1990s, the writing was on the wall. Making Russia a great power again was the theme of Yeltsin's presidential campaign in 1996. And during Putin's long tenure, his foreign policy has scored the highest approval rate for many years, including the illegal annexation of Crimea. Now, having said this, to me, we are where we are because of political choices made by the Russian leaders. There are many instances when Putin could have made other choices, but chose not to do so. In that sense, Putin is a product of Russia. Now, today, the war has become the political system. Only during the past year, draconian laws have been introduced in order to eradicate any form of dissent or opposition. Russia is on a neo-Stalinist trajectory. Censorship, denunciations, long sentences not seen since Stalin's time. There is zero tolerance for any kind of opposition. And the propaganda machine in state media is massive, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And in the newly annexed areas in Ukraine, deportations are back. And there is an ideological aspect here I'd like to take into account due to its long-term implications. In November last year, the Russian president signed a decree listing traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. The most important of these values, according to the decree, are life, dignity, to serve the fatherland and take responsibility for its destiny, to prioritize spiritual before material matters, collectivism, the historic memory of the fatherland, the unity of the peoples in Russia. At the same time, the so-called destructive ideology is defined. That's the West, that's us. It is said to promote violence, egotism, permissiveness, immorality, non-patriotism, and therefore constitute, I quote, an objective threat to Russia's national interest. It's described as alien to the Russian people. Consequently, combined with the changes in history books in schools, military, political, and patriotic education, this, to my mind, is an effort to try to create an ideology, thereby directly contradicting the Constitution. There it stipulated that no ideology may be established as a state or obligatory one. Furthermore, what we're seeing is very much the result of the current Russian leadership's view of sovereignty. Only a great power can be truly sovereign. Others cannot. The world order, according to this view, should be built on several poles: Russia, China, US, Brazil, India, and according to the Russian president, the Vienna Congress of 1815 and Yalta 1945 are good examples to follow. At the moment, the school of thought in Russia that emphasizes the imperial legacy, the need for buffer states, the Eurasian character of Russia dominates. But do not forget that there is another school of thought in Russian history, one that advocates respect for human life, negotiations rather than bomb dropping, respect for international agreements, and underlines that Russia is a European state. So, taking a longer time perspective on Russian strategic behavior, Russia as a geopolitical actor, I propose 4 variables, 4 structural conditions, if you will, factors influencing Russian strategy over time. 1, the armies, the military's position as a founding, integrated part of Russia as a state. The link between the military tools and the survivability of the ruler or regime, and which allocates larger part of the state resources to the military and defense. Secondly, territories, territorial expansion, driven in part for economic reasons and in part to protect the heartland, and preferably to wage wars away from the heartland. The uncertainty of borders, which we can see today too. From the Russians' military perspective, territories are crucial to the survival of Russia. Third, the demand for prestige and international great power status on the one hand, and an explicit feeling of insecurity on the other side of the coin. And finally, the nationality question. Russia is not and has never been a nation state. Only today there are over 90 ethnic minorities in Russia, and these four variables needs to be handled and balanced by Russia's leaders also in the future. So, what lies ahead? A few points. The consequences of the ongoing war are far-reaching and entail fast changes in Europe, in Ukraine, and Russia. And to my mind, we are only in the beginning of grasping the depth of what this means. We're in for the long haul. Russia's strategic political goals remain intact. And for Putin, as he has made explicit for many years now, Russia has both time and is on the right side of history. So how will it all end? I do not know. I will just end with a quote by the Russian philosopher and writer Vasily Rozanov as a reminder that change, when it comes, can be sudden and is always unpredictable. This is his short drama, La Divina Commedia, published in 1918. With a bang, a creak and a squeal, an iron curtain descended over Russian history. The performance was over. The audience stood up. It was time to put on the fur coats and go home. We turned around, but there were no fur coats, nor any homes. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Where will this neo-Stalinist trajectory take Russia in the coming years?
That remains to be seen.
I know.
That's the cowardly answer.
That's what you always can say when you're discussing Russia.
Yes. It also depends very much what's happening on the battlefield at the moment.
And that we don't know really.
No, but right now the trajectory is going in that direction. What hasn't happened is that Russia's borders are not closed, and the leaders have not yet declared a state of war in the country. That's the positive side.
You said that the ambition is to restore the empire. Is that the old large empire, or is it more restricted to someone, say, to Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, to build a sort of Russian-speaking union?
Well, Putin has been asked about this, and he responded, in this imperialistic manner, saying that all areas having had a relationship or been under Tsarist Russia or the Soviet Union. So that was the expansionist way. But evidently, since things are not going at all Russia's way, I think they eventually will have to scale down. But it was obvious from the beginning when Putin launched his Eurasian Economic Union that Ukraine must be in it.
He started the latest war in order to, as he said, to liberate Ukraine. And now a year later he seems just ambitious to reduce the country to rubble. So how does he get away with this at home? And how can he explain this change of strategy?
Well, the majority of, well, they have also put restrictions on Western social media, and this means, you know, for the educated elites, they have to have VPN to get out online, and there they can find other information. But if you just watch the Russian TV news, the picture from the war is completely different than the one we see. I try to watch this as often as I can, and it's not going at all bad. It's going according to plan. And as long as the majority of the Russian people are watching TV and get their news, you know.
Thank you, Gudrun, very much. Thank you. Sergey, Radchenko, I'm happy that you're back from your attempt to swim to Fagersta and back. I saw you yesterday morning with a perfect backstroke.
I was going to talk about Putin and Xi Jinping, but I was so inspired by previous presentations which dwelt on historical subjects that I thought it would be an utter disgrace for me as a historian not to delve into deep history. So please bear with me as I will take you back to the 1960s, a very different time for relations between Moscow and Beijing, but hopefully we'll take some broader lessons for the present day from that experience. I would like to start by going back to a meeting that Mao Zedong had on July 10th, 1964 with a delegation of Japanese socialists. Very famous meeting. In that meeting, the Japanese socialists complained that the Soviet Union was occupying certain islands. Kentaro knows about those. And Mao Zedong said, I understand you, I understand you. He lamented that the Soviet Union had robbed China of Mongolia and, I quote, occupied too many places, both in Europe at German, Polish, Romanian, and Finnish expense, and in Asia, where, according to Mao Zedong, it annexed territories east of Lake Baikal, that's a quote, including Khabarovsk, Vladivostok, and the Kamchatka Peninsula. And then he said ominously, we have yet to settle this bill with them. Now, the Japanese delegation went back to Japan, and these comments were published and came to the attention of the Soviet leadership, and they were absolutely outraged. Nikita Khrushchev said to his comrades on August 19th, 1964, have you read the hideous document about the border? Referring to Mao's comments. I read it yesterday and became indignant. He went on to talk about how the Chinese were, and I quote, evil, hypocritical, crafty, and cunning. But what really got under Khrushchev's skin was that Mao Zedong was, as Khrushchev was describing it, was feeding the bacillus of nationalism, though he knew full well that borders in the socialist world did not coincide with ethnic groups. It wasn't just the Soviets who had this problem. The Romanians, the Polish, the Hungarians, the Yugoslavs, they all had this problem. But not only that, the Chinese themselves had this problem, Khrushchev said, because they had also, under the Chinese emperors, conquered territories and enslaved peoples. He even proposed to ask the Chinese to free the people of Xinjiang, the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs, so that they could create a joint state with the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs of the Soviet Union. Although that proposal did not go beyond this discussion at the Politburo, I guess he reconsidered before sending it to the Chinese. This is criminal, Khrushchev fumed. It leads to butchery. That is, thinking about those historic borders and whatnot. It leads to butchery on people, and when this happens between states, this already creates wars. Well, guess who would have benefited from this advice? Sure enough, by the way, in 1969, China and the USSR fought a brief but very intense border war in the Far East on a little island called Zhenbaodao in Chinese, Damansky in Russian, Suri River that separates the two countries. The Chinese tried to sneak there, and the Soviet border guards turned up, and a really mean fight ensued. In fact, the Soviets showered the Chinese bank of the river with Grad rockets, and something like 1,000 Chinese were killed in this border war of 1969. It's a pretty major thing. And in fact, the Soviets were actually hinting at the possibility of preemptive nuclear strike against Chinese facilities, once again in 1969. How did it happen that Sino-Russian relations, Sino-Soviet relations, went from a perpetual unbreakable alliance of the 1950s to an actual war just in a matter of 10 years? Historians have come up with 4 broad explanations, and I will quickly talk about them. The first is ideology, the second is domestic politics, the third is national interests, and the fourth is clash of personalities. So let me talk about ideology. Basically, the argument there goes something like this. Well, the Chinese, after de-Stalinization started by Nikita Khrushchev in 1956, the Chinese thought this is betrayal of revolution. Stalin was a good guy, therefore, Khrushchev should have not criticized him, and all kinds of other issues were connected to that, including the question of war and peace, whether war is inevitable. The Chinese thought yes, the Soviets thought no. The question of peaceful transition to communism, the Soviets thought possibly, the Chinese thought no, you can only have revolution, and so on and so forth. So ideological struggle is important. And indeed, ideas, we know, can and often do guide actions. However, there's a problem, because ideas can also rationalize actions, legitimate actions taken for other reasons. Power can be sought, for example, to further ideas, or ideas can rationalize and legitimize the pursuit of power. So how do you disentangle these two issues? It's impossible. Plainly, it's impossible, and I'd say it's impossible even in the mind of the decision makers, because decision makers themselves often do not really know why exactly they're acting. And that is a challenge for us historians. How do we get to the bottom? Where's the truth? And of course, the counter-argument to that, well, why not embrace this, both of those explanations? Yes, ideas, yes, power. They are mutually reinforcing. What's the problem? And I guess there is no problem. Yeah, we can do that. And that's what historians do. They like multi-causality. But as a result, explanations do become a little bit fuzzy. And I would just say that I'm not personally convinced that ideology really does explain much in the Sino-Russian quarrel in the 1960s. Don't really have the time to go into this because I want to talk about domestic politics. Domestic politics, also very important. Everybody who is familiar with US foreign policy would know, of course, that domestic politics really define US foreign policy. Unless you know US domestic politics, it's impossible to talk about foreign policy, but it's also true for other countries, and certainly for China. And if you want to impress somebody, talking about China today, do not ask, what do you think Xi Jinping will do? But ask something like, what do you think is the relationship between Xi Jinping and Wang Huning? Ooh. Or what do you think? Do you think that Li Shangfu has actual clout? That is very, very impressive. And I have to say that already in the 1960s, you can see, well, certainly in the 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, we can see how Chinese domestic power struggle influenced the outcome for relations with Moscow, because Mao connected his internal enemies, people like Liu Shaoqi, people like Deng Xiaoping and others, with this idea of Soviet revisionism. So for as long as he struggled against those people domestically, he also needed to pursue a very hostile policy towards the Soviet Union. Those things connect. Third explanation, kind of sort of a little bit like in Rashomon, the the movie by Akira Kurosawa. You have this different competing explanation. So third explanation is national interests, and that is China and the Soviet Union had their irreconcilable national interest, and therefore they simply could not live together under the roof of one alliance. And okay, that's just not convincing. And I'll tell you why. The first point is, how do you even explain the alliance then in this case to begin with when they actually concluded the alliance? I mean, if they had such irreconcilable interests, then how on earth did they get into this alliance? And actually lived happily for 10 years before falling out. So generally the national interest thing is not very good at explaining change. Because national interests seem slightly mutable, they don't change, therefore how do you explain change? And then the other argument here is, well, what's the problem with the hierarchical alliance? I mean, the Soviet Union had other allies like Mongolia and satellites in Eastern Europe, and they got on okay. They were not falling out necessarily all that much. And the United States also has its own allies, and the power differential is great between, let's say, the United States and, I don't know, the Czech Republic. And yet, they're still in alliance. And of course, IR theorists have various explanations for this, and I will not go into them because I don't want to bore people to death with IR theory. Therefore, I wanted to use the Chinese saying, which you find in the title of my presentation about tigers. Two tigers, in Chinese it goes like that, 一山不容二虎. Two tigers cannot live on the same mountain. That's a Chinese saying. Two tigers cannot live on the same mountain, meaning China and the Soviet Union were these two tigers, they could not coexist. They could not coexist on the same mountain. It was not, it was not a case of tiger and a bunch of cats. And there's no Chinese saying for that. There's no Chinese saying. But tigers. There was something about the Chinese, whether it's the territory, whether it's the big population, whether it's the resources, or fundamentally the raw, unfettered, ruthless ambition that drove them, and that could not permit the Chinese leaders, or indeed, I dare say, the Chinese people, to find themselves locked in a relationship that was perpetually unequal, where they were constantly, perpetually the younger brother. It simply was not destined to last. Right, and the final fourth point, you're starting to,
Personal relations?
Personal, that's right. Personal, conflict of personality. So, Mao Zedong, he really did not like Stalin. He really hated Stalin, to be plain about it. But he deferred to Stalin. He saw the Sino-Soviet alliance as a kind of a Confucian family, where you had that, unloved son and an unloved father, but you still had to show some filial piety towards the father. You didn't really care for him. But then the father died, March 1953, and that became a moment of liberation for Mao Zedong, because he could not take orders from this new Soviet leadership, whom he thought are just clowns, upstarts, people who were not very sophisticated, not great philosophers, revolutionaries like him. So how could he take orders from them? They were just too arrogant, too presumptuous. He couldn't take that. He called the Sino-Soviet relationship a relationship of cat and mice, and he did not want to be a mouse, he said. Khrushchev, on the other hand, also despised Mao, comparing him, unfavorably, I must add, to Genghis Khan. And Khrushchev understood that the alliance was unequal. He understood that. But he thought that this lack of equality in the alliance was natural. And in fact, I've got a quote here for you from Khrushchev where he describes what actually drove Russia and China apart. And that's my final parting thought, almost. Here's what Khrushchev says about why he quarreled with the Chinese. It's a question of nationalism, a question of egotism. They want to play the first fiddle. But this is not decided by vote. This is determined by one's status and by the other's recognition. Even say among 5 or 10 people, they're friends, and one of them is the leader. They don't elect him, they just recognize him for certain qualities. This is how it is and how it will be in the future. People won't all be black or red-haired. There will be different colors and different temperaments and different mental capabilities among people. There will be inequality like elsewhere in nature. This is Khrushchev talking about Sino-Russian relation. He basically says, what are the Chinese thinking? We're so great, How can you compare? And I don't even know how to describe this. Is that ideology? No, it's not ideology. Is this, national interest? No. It's something cultural, almost racial to this explanation. There's something deeper here, and it kind of hints at the Russian sense of superiority vis-a-vis the Chinese and a sense of entitlement almost. Well, you do wonder, and that's my parting thoughts, what Mao thought of all of this. And I have to say that we do have some evidence. In 1970, he spoke to Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu of Romania was trying to get the Chinese to repair relations with the Soviet Union. Stop criticizing them, etc. You know what Mao said after Ceausescu asked him to mend fences? He said, "They piss on my head, and I shall not retaliate." Thank you.
Thank you. Is China supporting the war in Ukraine in some way or other?
Oh, we're back to the present, which is
Yes.
which is reasonable, fair game. The Chinese obviously do not want Putin to lose this war, nor do they want Putin to win this war. They like Russia where it is at the moment. Russia that is weakened, Russia that is beholden to China, Russia that is practically a vassal of China. From the Chinese perspective, isn't that a great thing? And wouldn't you be overjoyed if you were Xi Jinping to have Russia in this position? So that is why we've had that mediation effort from the Chinese side, hoping that the war could freeze and they could just keep things where they are. Yeah.
And China will keep on talking about good relations with Russia, manipulating Russia to China's advantage, rather than break up this relationship.
Well, yeah, and the Chinese know what they're doing. They're playing the long game. What I wonder about is what are the Russians doing? Because what is happening today is not, going back to national interest. And I dismiss national interest as rubbish. But actually, I think there's something to it. You can actually say there are objective national interests. And Russia, as it finds itself today, without leverage, isolated in the West, despised by so many, a weakened actor, much weakened actor. Is that in Russia's national interest? Absolutely not. What would be in Russia's national interest would be to stop its war in Ukraine and then kind of stand back and say, try to at least achieve some kind of form of non-alignment in what is inevitably shaping up to be the great confrontation of this century, the Sino-American confrontation. But they're not doing that. And that is what puzzles me. That is what I'm confused by, because Putin is so blinded by his absolute hatred of the West that he's betraying Russia's national interests in doing what he's doing.